Music is my life, or at least it was, for a great many years. By the late 1970s, I had apprenticed under the legendary Bill Graham as a stage manager and sound engineer at the Fillmore East, and spent time in Europe working for the Rolling Stones, among other bands. I loved rock and roll, and I loved the rock and roll life, traveling around the world, experiencing different cultures, never settling into a quiet and pedestrian 9-to-5 existence. Admittedly, rock stars are not always the easiest folks to work with, but by and large, the benefits outweighed the negatives. I was young and single and enamored of the bohemian vagabond life. It suited me, and I was pretty good at just about any job that came my way. But nothing quite prepared me for the 7-year ride that was Van Halen. And when I refer to Van Halen, I refer to the original incarnation of the band, which disintegrated in 1985 with the departure of David Lee Roth. I left around the same time, which, as you'll see, was not exactly a coincidence. Nothing against Sammy Hagar, fine singer and by all accounts a genial enough guy, but the real Van Halen died with the departure of David. I say that as both a compliment and a condemnation, for David's exit brought about the wreckage of a band that was at the height of its powers and popularity and could have dominated the music scene for another decade had common sense and reason prevailed. Maybe that's part of what made Van Halen so great. Almost from the outset, this was a band that appeared, at least from the inside, to have a limited shelf life. Too much talent and too much ego, too many disparate personalities, too much drugs and alcohol. They had to be great right from the beginning, because there was no way it could last. Not that I knew any of this in late January 1978, when I got a call from Carl Scott, a senior vice president in charge of artist development and touring at Warner Brothers. At the time, I was living in New York, but had made a second home out of the Hyatt House on Sunset Boulevard. The Hyatt House was nicknamed the Riot House because of its popularity with the bands that would come through L.A. They'd stay there while playing the Whiskey A Go-Go or one of the other nearby clubs. Like I said, rock and roll was my life, on or off the road. I was 31 years old and fit right in at a hotel frequently overrun with drunk and drugged-out rockers and their entourages. It felt like home. Well, fewer cockroaches, but you can't have everything. While technically an independent contractor paid by the gig, I was, for all intents and purposes, an employee of Warner, and Carl Scott was my mentor. Gifted at business and generous of spirit, Carl taught me a lot about the music industry and helped ensure that I had a steady stream of work. Although primarily a sound engineer and stage manager in my younger days, I had just come off a short, but nonetheless memorable stint as head tour manager for the Sex Pistols, the infamous punk band fronted by snarling vocalist John Layden, a.k.a. Johnny Rotten, and doomed bassist/heroin addict Sid Vicious. The Pistols, assembled in 1975 as a gimmick by London artist, boutique owner, and all-around textbook narcissist Malcolm McLaren, was founded to stick it to English classism while simultaneously providing his store with millions in free advertising. After a handful of lineup changes and the release of the seminal punk album Nevermind the Bollocks, they briefly became, if not the hottest band in the world, by far the most controversial and the most polarizing. The Sex Pistols were poster boys for a nascent punk movement that owed as much to New York's Ramones as it did to any of the other UK bands that had come before them. They were volatile and vitriolic, fueled not by a need to change the musical landscape, but by a lethal combination of anger, alcohol, drugs, and youth. They hit hard and fast, destroying everything in their paths, only to burn out before they'd barely gotten started. Although sometimes dismissed by detractors because of their apparent nihilism and onstage antics that included Vicious mutilating himself with broken beer bottles and Layden hitting the snarling, spitting, and cursing trifecta, doing his best to agitate the audience through a mouthful of gray teeth, there was much more to the band than initially met the eye. In reality, the Pistols were a sensational band whose lone album remains one of the most influential and critically acclaimed records of all time. They were a ferocious live act that terrified older and more staid members of the music industry, not to mention the parents of the adolescents who bought Nevermind the Bollocks and who attended shows deemed not just wrong.